Okay, welcome to this video where I will be discussing Benatar's asymmetry. I'm a bit of a layman, I'm a bit of a casual, I'm not super well trained, but I think that could be an advantage here. I'm going to try and put it into the words of an ordinary person like myself, someone who is not formally educated in philosophy, but who takes an interest in this subject because it personally applies to me. I could potentially have children. And so what Benatar is saying here, I think, is important. It's an important topic. I think we can at least agree on that, whether you agree or disagree with his idea. And if you've reached this video, if you've sought out this video, or if you've reached this video somehow, you've stumbled upon it, then that puts you in a very small category of people who are actually reflecting on this topic of procreation, which has enormous gravity to it, and you're actually thinking critically about it. So well done just for getting here. I think that puts you in a very small group of people. I might be pausing this video at different times because this is a conversation. I want to create a conversation around this where we try to steelman the position, we try to critique and stress test this asymmetry chart. But for now, I'm going to try and put this in my own words. This is kind of tough for me. I'm pretty new to the subject. David Benatar, he wrote this book, which I've read, which is called Better Never to Have Been. He kind of starts this book off. The main central pillar is this idea of asymmetry. It may be the most important argument he makes, and he really stakes a lot in this claim. But if I am to steelman this, I would say that Benatar's asymmetry, first of all, it's descriptive. So he's making an observation about the act of procreation, okay? He's not telling you what you need to do. He's not necessarily instructing you. He's describing the act of creating a new life, okay? Abstaining from procreation and childbirth, okay? So we've got, if we draw our attention here, very simple chart, right? Very simple, it's laid out in a very simple table. Along here you have harm and benefit, okay? Benefit, you can imagine things like, I don't know, orgasms or reading a good book, taking a nice walk along the beach at sunset, seeing a long lost friend, relative or loved one at the airport, embracing them, all of the nectar of life, okay? Just go crazy with this idea, right? The real essence of enjoyment and the nectar of life. It can be as rich and complex as you like, okay? Because sometimes I want to give color and images to these ideas because otherwise this is quite bland. It's quite a boring chart, okay? And with harm, you can imagine a range of things. Okay, we're really reducing things down here to positive and negative, which is often the utilitarian way, which I do take issue with, but at a certain point we have to, right? If we're going to talk about this, we've got to start somewhere. So for harm, you can think of loneliness, depression, pain, despair, fear. Fear is a terrible one. Stuff like that. I don't need to elaborate too much. I think your own imagination can really fill that one out. And on this axis, we have whether someone exists or whether someone never existed. Now, this is really tough to get your head around, okay? As a being that exists, it's really tough for you to imagine never existing. Often, people imagine having never existed, right? They imagine that as death. They imagine that as being killed or being Thanos snapped, right? Having a life up until a certain point and then having that cut off. I would argue that this is very different, right? This is a concept that this person has no interests. They cannot want anything and they cannot suffer from anything, including desire. They cannot suffer from desire. Really hard to wrap your head around. A lot of people really struggle with this. It's very important to understand that this is a placeholder for an absence. It's like holes, right? A hole is like the absence of ground. Now, you can say all you want that holes don't exist, but when it comes to walking into one, you're going to find out that a hole does exist, right? Someone who fails to acknowledge that holes exist is going to fall into the ground and break their arm, okay? So we came up with the concept of holes so that you can say, hey, watch out, there's a hole there. Yes, technically, holes don't exist, right? Hole is the absence of something, but it really helps for me to be able to say, watch out, there's a hole over there, right? So as a construct, it's useful, right? This is a construct of thinking. It's an extension of logical thought. It's an extension of logic that helps to describe the act of procreation, right? So in this quadrant, we have the presence of harm. Someone exists and there is a presence of harm in their life. They could be feeling heartbroken. They could have lost the love of their life. They could have lost them to a terrible, ravishing disease. They could be languishing in a jail cell after being accused of a crime they don't commit. And he would say that the fact that person exists and they're being harmed is bad. These words are heavily contested. This is where the real battle is being fought epistemologically. I'm a casual when it comes to philosophy and ethics. So I'm going to put in brackets bad. But let's go over to the other side. If you've never existed, the absence of harm, he would argue, is good. It's good that you're not here. It's good that this person's not here to experience that hellfire. So that is good. Again, heavily contested. Every single quadrant here has been switched around, has been contested over by philosophers. He's boiling it down to the simplicity that if you've never existed, the fact that you're not being harmed, like you're not being tortured, is a good thing. Now, myself, I would say as an animal rights activist, just to draw comparisons here, animal rights activists trying to make people aware of the torture that farm animals go through. The consequence of stopping these terrible, torturous factory farm, kill floors, slaughterhouses, the consequences of that is that there will be less of the animal population. And we would say, yes, that's a good thing. It's a good thing that less of them are being tortured. Less pigs are being tortured in gas chambers. Less chickens are being forced into tiny battery hen cages, right? Less cows are drowning in their own blood after having their throats slit. We would say that's a good thing. So Benatar is saying that if you've never existed and there's no harm, that's good. If you exist and there's a presence of a benefit, right? You fall in love, you experience all the joys of falling in love, let's say, or you read a lovely book, it gives you a cathartic feeling, put something in here that really makes you happy to be alive. He would acknowledge, he'd say that is good. Now we come to the most contested, perhaps the most contested of all the quadrants, which is the absence of a happy life. All right, this is really, there's a lot of fighting going on here. So I've got to be careful with my words. Now, I believe Benatar's exact words are that if someone's never existed and there's the absence of a happy life, that is not bad. Now, he's not saying it's good, it's not bad, right? So that's the asymmetry, okay? So we've got a cross here, we've got a tick here, we've got a tick here on this never existed, but here we don't have a cross, right? Which we don't have a cross. We have nothing. It's neutral. It's not a thumbs up or a thumbs down. which means that this side is unbalanced. This is asymmetrical, right? So to never having existed wins, right? Because this has a good and a bad, but this side has a neutral and a good. Therefore, to never having existed, to not being brought into existence is preferable. But what he's really getting at, I believe, the conclusion that he draws to this, it's a lot more specific, it's a lot more pointed. And you're going to hear a lot of people who reject Benatar's antinatalism. What they're going to do is they're going to open this up and make it a very general discussion. You're going to hear a lot on the whole. Overall, Benatar is simply saying one specific thing, which is that it's always a harm. The act of procreation is always a harm. He's not telling you, in this specific situation, you have the freedom to use your own body. You should just know that it's always a harm to procreate and bring a new life into the world. Even if, and what a lot of people say is, like, what if the life only has minimal suffering, right? It only has minimal amount of harm. And this is where Benatar has a different approach to me, because he's more like a real philosopher. I'm an amateur, and I'm actually speaking to regular people who don't think along the lines of like logical consistency. I'm more just connected to regular people, and I think like a regular person. I don't think like a philosopher, right? I'm not having to prove these things epistemologically. I'm not having to stress test them a lot. But Benatar is heavily scrutinized by people. So the reason this is the way it is because it has to be extremely watertight. Because people want to have kids. He's saying that if you procreate, it's always a harm. You exist, and the presence of harm is as small as a pinprick. That's his example. A pinprick, in terms of the asymmetry, that still outweighs, that is still harm enough to make this asymmetrical in principle, okay? In principle. Obviously, we don't behave like that, and we don't think along those lines usually, but he's proving the logic, okay? Logically, even a single pinprick is worse than to have never existed, okay? Now, I just want to say, I want to steel man here that nobody has ever gotten through their lives with such a minimal harm done to them. Everyone dies. Many people die while they're conscious, while they're awake. And just because it happens 70 years after they're being born, or 80, 90, 100 years after them being born, that's the same life that was initiated through procreation. And so if they face an unpleasant death, like cancer, which is very common, they experience bodily functions shutting down at the end of their life, right? That's all caused by procreation. It's all started by procreation. It's set in motion. So nobody experiences minimal harm. That's how I would steel man this. I would say, find me a case, okay? We can even go into it. So he's just saying that on principle, a pinprick is more harm than someone who's never existed, right? A pinprick is less preferable to not having existed, if you're thinking about harm. Let's get into a few critiques. Let me pause for a moment. I'll gather my thoughts and then we'll go into a few critiques. So when I talk about antinatalism, if I even bring up the word antinatalism, people go straight to the asymmetry argument. This is the most definitive argument made, but people bring this up to me, and when they do, if I say I want to talk about procreation, they'll start their conversation with me with a critique of asymmetry. Okay, so I've been exposed to quite a few critiques of this, and it's a good chance to stress test this concept and to steel man it potentially. My angle is different from Benatar's, right? My angle is a lot less about proving that it's always a harm, which is, I guess that's a really strong statement to make, right? It's really powerful to say that no matter how little the harm, procreation always causes harm. It's a very powerful statement to lead with, which means that there are no exceptions. And we can get into that, but I would just say that if you want to ask me personally, the thing that I find more compelling as a potential father, like someone who could at any moment choose to procreate, right? I settled down with a wife, we're both fertile. For me, it's not about that. That's not compelling personally. The thing that's more compelling, we're starting with this to then talk about probability, to talk about the danger and the S risks, okay? Because you can look at the life of someone who's having a good life, who's going to have a good life, and you could say that that's fine. But as I outlined in my previous video, there is a probability, there's a danger that you cannot control. You cannot control this, that they're going to experience like an S risk, right? An S risk is a fate worse than death, put simply. And based on the fact that there is a chance that your future child could experience a fate worse than death that is outside of your control, right? You can't control if Vladimir Putin detonates a nuke on your country and your child happens to be within the blast radius but not within the epicenter. So your child isn't instantly killed, but their skin melts off. They lose all of their skin. Severe burns that last for weeks in hospital. You can't control that. That's a terrible fate. I just have to go there in your imagination, right? And that is plausible and it's outside of your control. And I would argue, my angle is that procreating exposes someone else to that danger. You are endangering a new life. You are causing that to happen through your decisions. They're so angry, are they? Okay, we can continue finally. And it's not fair that you get to endanger, you get to initiate that sequence of events that exposes someone else to that danger. That's my argument. I think that's more compelling for an average person who's not up their own arse with these philosophical consistency type books that we weirdos are sometimes, that the philosophy circles are in. And I'm not saying philosophers are wrong to seek consistency in their arguments. I'm just saying it's not compelling to an average person when it comes to what they're actually going to act on in their lives. Okay, so this is my little corner here. That's my contribution, really. And that's how I choose to see it. I can't help but see that truth to it. But anyway, let's get into steel manning. I'm going to go straight for the obvious one, which is the absence of a happy life is not bad, right? This, I told you before, heavily contested, that it's not bad, or sometimes he will say that it's neutral. Someone will say that it's neutral. I'll give an example, first of all, of what he means, like an intuitive example. If you think of Mars, the population of Mars is 0. Is it bad that there are no Martians living on Mars right now? No, not really. It kind of is irrelevant, right? Like, our attention should be, no one's mourning for the fact that there are no Martians living on Mars right now. Like, that's just a neutral thing, right? It's just a fact, and no one's going to grieve or mourn for the fact that there are no Martians living on Mars. So that would be Benatar's argument. Now, a channel that you might be familiar with if you roll with these circles, that someone that I very much respect. I think he's way more qualified than me. He's got a lot of great opinions. I'm a long-term subscriber, long-term follower, big fan. perspective philosophy, right? I actually asked him on Discord, I just said, is there anything wrong with Benatar's argument? And he had a lot to say, right? He said, of course, that there can be, that it can be bad for there to be the absence of a happy life. And he gave the example of a Pacific island, let's say Hawaii or Easter Island, right? You could imagine looking across from Kauai that there's another island over there that would be perfectly lovely for a town to live. And the people of Hawaii could look across the fog and the mist and see that no one's living there. And the people could say, what a shame. They could feel like collectively that it's sad that there is not a lovely, happy community living on that island. And so he says that it's a load of baloney, that the absence of happy life, like a happy civilization, a happy community living, you can imagine them playing on the beach, swimming in the sea, just having a great time, parties at night with drum circuit, whatever. He would say that it is bad. It could be even seen as objectively bad, that those experiences, if you're thinking on a bigger level, it could be objectively bad that there is not a little town there living peacefully and happily, right? That's objectively just like, it's bad because it's like, it's a form of deprivation. You're depriving a community of the essence of life. I am abbreviating his words, all right? But he would say that it's not true that it's not bad. Now, that statement is very dangerous. It's very dangerous to say that the absence of a happy life, on the whole happy, we've determined that it's always a harm, but a life where there is some harm, but it's also happy. There's no such thing as a purely happy life or a purely miserable life, right? There's degrees, but it has some of each. It's dangerous to say that the absence of a happy life is bad. Why is that? Well, I've prepared a little area here. Now, if you do want to contest Benatar's asymmetry with a claim like this, you have to be very careful to not end up in this hellfire over here. Okay? So, the moment we say that the absence of a happy life is bad, you risk being transported over here, where it becomes a moral obligation to not deprive people of life, which leads to Handmaid's Tale, right? Forced pregnancy, like, well, not forced, but like heavily encouraged, just as many babies as possible. Everyone needs to procreate as many times as possible, otherwise you're depriving people of life, right? You see how it gets into this really fucked up situation. Mandatory forced births, potentially. I mean, no one's really saying that, but it's a slippery slope, right? At the very least, a moral obligation to have as many kids as possible, because even if they grow up in a slum, the absence of a happy life is bad. Even if collectively overpopulation like leads to overall worse living conditions to everyone, and it's causing a lot of problems, you've got to do it, like, because morally, all right? So you've got to be careful when rejecting this to not actually imply that everyone should procreate as much as possible. Moral obligation, max kids, right? Max kids. It's very easy. It's actually very easy morally to imply, if you reject this, it's very easy to imply that everyone should have the max number of kids, which is absurd. You end up with the Handmaid's Tale, or some kind of version of the Handmaid's Tale. And in a way, many societies aren't far off from having like a social version of the Handmaid's Tale, where the social punishment for choosing to not procreate is to be ostracized. There are certain Indian communities, there are certain South American communities where the elders will really scorn and scold and punish anyone who decides to not procreate, which I think is a little bit fucked up. It's not as going as far as to have an overseeing government, like a security state, you know, a surveillance state that enforces these things. It's not as extreme as that, but it is a little bit fucked up if you think about it, that elders place this pressure on the young to just be baby machines, you know? And that's a lot of what conservative thinking is as well. Conservative thinking is subjugating women and making sure socially that women only have one option, which is to not live for themselves, but live for the purpose of making babies. Another thing perspective philosophy told me is that the absence of harm being good, he said this is kind of like a form of, and I'm using my own words here, but it's kind of like a form of selective hallucination, right? You're saying that the absence of harm here is a tangible, real good thing, but how can we say that about something that doesn't exist? Whereas he's choosing to not hallucinate when it comes to, he's not choosing to hallucinate any tangible harm when it comes to the absence of a happy life. Now, he's way more articulate than this, so you should go over to his channel, maybe he has a video on this, but he was very generous in sharing his opinions with me, and I'm grateful to him. He also talked about like selecting certain categories here as being subjective and certain categories as being objective, right? So for example, the presence of harm, he would say that's objectively bad, right? So he's trying to claim objectivity with ones like this, the presence of harm being bad, the presence of benefit being good. But then in other cases, like in other categories, probably the absence of harm, he would say that's like a subjective statement, right? That's not objective. Objectively, there is nothing here. Like objectively, the absence of harm being good, that's not an objective statement. That's a subjective statement. That's his opinion that the absence of harm is good. So he would say that some of these quadrants, he's claiming objectivity. Others, he cannot claim that he's being objective. He's being subjective. That's what perspective philosophy told me. In my own words, if I had to summarize. So there's all these are kind of taking jabs at these quadrants of these graphs, trying to assert that either you're not correct in making these assessments, like you're not able to make that claim as a solid claim, or that certain quadrants don't exist. And that's the next one I'll get onto. So talking about hallucination, selective hallucination, one other person said in a comment, which is, I mean, that's their opinion, but he said he doesn't believe in asymmetry because he doesn't think that this half exists, right? He says that this whole part of like having never existed, the absence of harm is good, the absence of a happy life is not bad. He said this doesn't exist, right? Like to him, that's just make-believe because these people don't exist yet. I think this critique is bullshit and it brings me back to the holes thing. You can tell me that holes don't exist, but the absence of something for the sake of, you know, if we're trying to determine something very important within our lives and within future lives, it doesn't really help the discussion to treat the future as if it doesn't exist. And this is what a lot of people have tried to do with me, is to say that this never existed. We reject the hallucination. But I would say that the hallucination of wholes, like a whole being present, right, is useful. It's useful to be able to look at an empty space and actually ascribe a property to that empty space, or to look into the future and actually plan for the future. So it actually really annoys me that there are people who are just like unwilling to make any future predictions at all. Like you're not going to predict that the sun will rise tomorrow. That doesn't help anyone. And it's actually very annoying. It's very annoying that you're not going to make a reasonable deduction that this having never existed is a choice that people can make through contraception. You can choose to wear contraception, and if you do, you will not have a child, right? But if you choose to not wear contraception, then most likely you will start popping out kids. That's going to happen. It just hasn't happened yet. Feels like I'm talking to a 4-year-old here, but it's kind of like, no, I can't see it. I can't see it because it's in the future. No, I can't hear it because it's in the future. It's kind of annoying, right? To just say that this asymmetry, I reject it because this isn't real. Yeah, it isn't real. Technically speaking, the future doesn't exist. But if you stop wearing a condom, there will be consequences further down the line, and you will deal with those consequences, and your children that are born as a result will deal with your unwillingness to engage. That's me trying to steel man that. I think a stronger argument is if you just miss this completely, right? Like one thing people often answer with when it comes to this is they just kind of gloss over this. They say, yeah, sure, it's a harm, but people should have the freedom to choose, right? It's kind of like a platitude. It's like, you can't tell people what to do with their bodies, with their reproductive systems. And I think what Benatar would say, to steelman this, I think what Benatar would say as that is two things. First of all, this has nothing to do with restricting freedoms. He actually has a chapter on that, which is very good. It's quite well thought out. But this is only saying, it's only pointing at someone and saying, by the way, it's always a harm. That's all he's saying. He's not saying we should ban childbirth. We should enforce contraception, right? That's almost as dark as The Handmaid's Tale. To stop people from doing what's natural is pretty fucked up. So he's not saying that. He's just pointing out that it's always a harm. So like, you will be causing harm if you choose, based on the information, you will be causing a harm by procreating. That's all he's pointing out. He's saying it's always a harm, and he's saying that if you are aware of this, then you will kind of be responsible morally for the harm that you cause through procreation. And he would also say, the second thing he would say is that, and this is what vegans say a lot of the time as well, we should have the freedom to endanger people. That's what the objection is. And he would say, you're not the victim. Who's the victim in this? The victim of procreation. You could see yourself as the victim of procreation because you'll be burdened with taking care of that child. That's true. But it's not about that. The person who has to deal with this, the consequences of this decision, is not primarily you. It's the child. Like, the child is going to have to grow up and deal with all this shit. Like, the child is going to have to grow up in this world and deal with a lot of bullshit. They're going to have to do their taxes, right? Every year. They're going to have to do taxes because of you, because you decided to procreate, right? Now that I'm here, I have to do these taxes, right? And it's like, that's just an example. But the thing is, like, should we have the freedom to control the lives of others morally? I'm not sure. As a vegan, we get faced with this a lot. People will say, we should have the freedom to farm animals. It's my right to control animals and treat them as objects. And I would say, you're not the victim. Morally, you maybe shouldn't have the freedom to control others' lives, to restrict their freedom, to lock them in cages, to kill them at a time of your choosing, to deprive them of the lives that you have started through forced impregnation of these farm animals, right? You shouldn't have the right to be able to beat your slaves, to hurt your slaves because you're not the victim. Does that mean if everyone should be free to do what they want, do I have the freedom to punch you in the face? There should be a kind of field of, if you reach outside of your field of personal autonomy and it encroaches on someone else's freedom, that becomes a problem. Everything, like the choice of procreation creates a whole bunch of dangers, risks, and problems for someone else, right? So while I'm not saying that we should restrict people's procreative abilities through law, I am saying that morally there are consequences to making such a decision. Am I wrong with that? I don't think so. I don't think I'm wrong with saying that. And my next video will be about how intuitively people understand this, and intuitively many people are casual antinatalists. They just don't see it that way. They don't take it the full way there. But a lot of people would agree with me that if the situation is bad, that maybe you shouldn't have more kids, right? If you're birthing kids into a really bad situation, maybe the moral choice is to not do that, right? So a lot of people actually agree, but they just agree on a more casual level. They will say things like, oh, you're unemployed and you're claiming benefits. Both parents are unemployed. You have 8 kids already, but you want to have a 9th kid in a trailer park? Like, they see something wrong with that. So it's usually that someone's like in the middle, right? They're usually not actually they object to this, they object to max kids, but they're not quite on the same page here with the morals, even though this makes a strong statement and quite a solid point. So there are actually good critiques when you start thinking outside the box. I think a lot of people, they try to critique this, and that's actually quite difficult, but it's easier to critique it if you just zoom out a little bit, right? So one critique is that there's no context to this. Benatar would say that that's its greatest strength, that this is applied, it's applicable everywhere, it applies to every single birth. Someone else might say, there's no context to this, which is a weakness, right? The overall conclusion and the ways that this branches out is that we shouldn't have kids morally, right? But that ignores context. Sometimes the situation might be good where it's reasonable to believe that it's a good call to make. Sometimes it might be that the overall needs of the community will outweigh the harm that's caused by bringing a new life in, and they need young people, right? Population collapse, things like that. That could be a contextual argument that overrides the harm that's caused through procreation. The well-being of this entire group of people outweighs the harm that's set in motion through procreation. I suppose the act of procreation itself is not, but it inevitably will precipitate harm being caused later on. So yeah, no context is a potential critique. I don't know about that though, because I don't think it's trying to be this contextual thing. I don't think the asymmetry argument really cares about context. It's just saying that on a personal level, it's always a harm. And I would extend that to say that often it's a really harmful act. Like, it's probably the most harmful act that a non-criminal, like an ordinary average Joe could make, the most harmful act you could ever commit. It's not committing an act, it's precipitating more harm than anything else they're probably likely to do. And it's exposing someone else to danger. Another argument that one of my other friends made, he said, presence of harm is bad and the presence of benefit is good. He described life, and this is a very general assessment, but he said that if I could reduce it down, the presence of harm in a life that exists is quite bad. He said the benefits of someone that exists are really good. So, based on his life experience as a white male in Great Britain born of a pretty average family like me. He asserted that the presence of harm in the lives of those who are born everywhere, the presence of harm is quite bad. It's a bummer, right? He's downplaying that. But he said the presence of benefit, even the small benefits, even the small benefits, listening to a bit of music, it's really good. It's really good. This very much runs against the Stoic philosophers. I don't know if it was Epictetus that said that removing harm is superior to creating benefit. Like if you have a stone in your shoe and you're eating an ice cream, you won't be able to enjoy the ice cream. And it's actually better to remove the stone in your shoe than it is to like just buy more ice cream, right? But in terms of if the presence of harm is like this arrow, but the presence of good is like, so that kind of ignores this never existed one, and it's just talking about life, right? Because it kind of doesn't really engage in the neutral, which avoids harm and it also avoids pleasure. But I would also say that if the outcome of this is that it's always preferable to exist, it does kind of pressure people to have the max number of kids. It goes back to the deprivation argument. Does this become a deprivation argument? Maybe. I also think there's something that rubs me the wrong way about that. Downplaying the suffering of like people who went through Auschwitz. I don't know. I don't think he can really make that claim. He's had a relatively good life. I don't think he's necessarily qualified to say that. We, as a generation, have been raised in an era of relative peace and prosperity and relative comfort. And that could all change really fast through nuclear hot war, through viruses, a variety of different ways, through war. Mainly war breaking out would be really bad. And that would drastically decrease people's quality of life. And that can happen. It's not within your control. And you don't know if it's going to happen, and you can't actually tell what's going to happen 10 years from now. And your child will be alive 10 years from now if you decide to procreate now. So again, I think my extension here comes in handy with things like that. But also telling a cancer patient that like, on the whole, your life is good. I don't know. I don't think you can make that claim. I heard someone critique it by saying that it's too narrow. We're talking about harm, which entails suffering, which we can imagine is things like cutting your hand when you're chopping vegetables, or being in a war and being hit by a bullet. These are things where you feel acute pain in the body. And someone said that that's too narrow. It's typical narrow-minded utilitarianism where they're just obsessed with pain. It's a very shallow way to look at life, which is all about pleasure and pain, orgasms versus scrapes and bruises, right? It's too simple. It's really like child logic. And so this guy said, I actually don't care about harm. So the harm thing is irrelevant to me. I don't think in terms of that. That's not what I value. My values are all based around freedom, right? Replace this idea of pain and harm with freedom. I'm trying to live in a way that maximizes freedom for me and freedom for others. That's what he would say. Which I don't really get that. I don't know if this graph would be the best for this. Someone who exists can experience more freedom than someone who never existed. I think that's the idea. It's a bit of a tough one for me to describe because I don't see it that way exactly. I think that freedom can just be factored into this graph, right? Freedom, security, factors like that, you can kind of summarize them as harm and benefit. Seeing it as freedom instead of harm and benefit is actually just committing the same thing that it accuses this graph of, right? Because Benatar, while he is using the word harm and benefit, he is factoring in things like freedom and security, or whatever the thing is that absence of fear, all of the things you can imagine. He is doing that. He's just having to describe them as harm and benefit, which may linguistically have a trigger in your mind the idea of physical pain, but it doesn't have to be. It can be, freedom says nothing about loneliness. You know, often people who have more freedom are often more lonely. You can think of people like Notch, who became a billionaire from selling Minecraft. He struggled with major depression. He bought the most expensive house in America, like the most expensive LA mansion in America. And he said he was incredibly sad. He was desperately sad. There were like no more achievements for him. He had all the money and he had no friends, but he had like ridiculous levels of freedom. Freedom is a weird one. And I think this actually does speak to life more because it's asking you to bring in everything you know, to collate everything you know about the world and to put them into positive or negative. It's asking you to do that. So it's like, it's a you problem if you're unable to do that, but it's not his problem necessarily. So that would be my steel man of that. I don't know if I'm right though. I don't know if I'm right about any of this. I'm exploring this with you. I think that Benatar's asymmetry is a compelling argument. It's like the tip of the spear of Benatar's argument in his book. Perspective philosophy thinks it's a load of shit. He thinks it's committing a whole lot of fallacies in the subjectivity, objectivity, the fact that it lacks context is a problem. It's like selective hallucination of what is a harm. Nothing can be good or bad if it doesn't exist. So it's kind of like pretending that the future has no potential good or bad outcomes. Because what we're really talking about with never existed is like a potential future person. But a lot of people reject that. And on a metaethics level, perhaps it doesn't hold up. I don't think anyone outside of metaethics really listens to metaethics. I think they go based on intuition, and I'm no different to that. But he might have a point. Like, maybe this is unstable. But I think that this statement that it's always a harm to procreate, I'm just thinking about it, and I think it's true in every case, in every recorded case in history. So that's looking at the past, and on first principles it does appear to be correct. His argument of like the absence of happy life is not bad, that was a claim that would only be experienced, that badness would only be experienced of people outside of the victim, the subject of the victim. He's saying that it would be bad for that happy life, but he's committing the same fallacy that he accuses Benatar of. The only people who would experience that badness are like the community, like people who are not the victim. Like, you know, it would be like those Pacific Islanders who are looking across the waters to the uninhabited thing. The only people who are feeling sad about that are the islanders, and it's not concerning them. Like, it doesn't concern them because they're not living those lives. They're just projecting their own lives onto that, and it's not really about them. It's a personal thing about the lives of these non-existing people. And Benatar's not making that claim. He's just saying that from the subjective point of view of the individual who's being brought into existence, it will be a harm to them. The precipitating action is procreation. If you don't procreate, that individual will never experience any harm, never experience any good, but that gets into the whole problem with deprivation. Deprivation can only be experienced by someone who exists. You can only experience deprivation if you exist. Someone who's never existed cannot experience deprivation. And this is where people who make a deprivation claim, they are the ones hallucinating. They are hallucinating the suffering caused through deprivation to someone who doesn't exist. Hopefully I've explained this well enough. If there's something that I missed, sure, there probably is. I've tried my best. This is how I see it right now. We haven't really gone down what this asymmetry entails, what it suggests, like what the next moves are. Once we acknowledge, if we acknowledge that it's always a harm, what does that imply from there? Where do we go from there? This initiates a lot of other topics. we'll talk about them in other videos. But yeah, this channel is called The Child's Choice, and this is just one part of a discussion where I try to understand perhaps the most important decision anyone can make in their life. If you're a regular person like me, you're not a CEO, you're not the leader of some kind of army, you're not a politician, the child's choice is possibly the most important choice you'll ever make in your life. I'm at the age where I could, if I wanted, become a father, but I don't know if I should. And so this channel is me sharing, it's me documenting my process of trying to understand whether or not I should procreate. So far, I'm really vibing with the idea of adoption. If I'm eligible for adoption, that just seems like an amazing idea. But all of that will have to wait until another video. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and see you in the next one. Goodbye.